In March of 2015, 68-year-old Tamara Samsonova was having renovations done to her home in St. Petersburg, Russia. A friend of hers, 79-year-old Valentina Ulanova, had heard about Tamara's renovations, and she approached her and said, "Do you want to stay with me while that's getting done?" Tamara was very thankful, immediately said yes, and as soon as she moved in, she immediately started picking up the slack by cleaning up the house and doing the dishes, and made sure she always cooked food for her friend because she wasn't able to pay rent. After a couple of weeks, the renovations on Tamara's home were complete, but Tamara didn't want to leave. She was really enjoying living with Valentina, and so she asked Valentina, would it be okay if she stayed a little bit longer? Valentina was a little bit reluctant, but did ultimately say, okay, that's fine. A couple of months go by, and Tamara is showing no sign that she plans on leaving Valentina's home anytime soon, and Valentina is getting increasingly frustrated with that reality. Finally, in late July 2015, Valentina confronts Tamara and says, "You gotta go." And Tamara just says, "No, I'm not leaving." This causes a huge fight, but at the end of it, Tamara still doesn't leave. So for a couple of days, the women just do not speak to each other. The silence is finally broken on July 23rd when the women get into a fight about some empty cups in the sink that one of them was supposed to clean, but they didn't. And they fought about whose responsibility it was to do the dishes. And then of course, the whole subject comes up again of Valentina saying, "You shouldn't even be here, you need to leave." And Tamara's like, "No, I'm not gonna leave." And so another big blowout fight happens. But at the end of this fight, Tamara finally concedes and says, "Okay, I get it. I need to leave. Just give me a couple of days and I'll be out of your hair." Immediately, the tension is gone in the room. They're no longer fighting. And Valentina is happy that she's finally going to get her apartment back. And Tamara says, "Look, I'll make us dinner tonight. I'll go out and get some food." Tamara leaves the apartment and goes to a pharmacy and gets a whole bunch of sleeping pills. And then she gets the ingredients to a particular salad that she knows Valentina really likes. She goes back, she starts making dinner, and as she's making this salad, she crushes up the sleeping pills and mixes the powder with the salad dressing and gives that to Valentina. And Valentina, who's very hungry, eats the whole salad and doesn't notice anything is wrong. As soon as Tamara was sure Valentina had eaten the entire salad, Tamara just goes up to her room and goes to bed. A couple hours later, at about 2 a.m, she goes back down to the kitchen and she sees Valentina is passed out on the ground. Tamara goes up to her and sees that she's still breathing, which was a disappointment because she wanted her to die from taking all these sleeping pills. But it doesn't matter. She takes out her hacksaw that she had borrowed from the neighbor earlier in the day and proceeds to butcher Valentina. And she makes special care as she's cutting her into pieces to remove her lungs and not damage them, because Tamara had a taste for human lungs. It was actually her favorite food. She took Valentina's head and she put it into a big pot of water and began boiling that to eat it. The rest of her was cut up into as small of pieces as she could get them and then wrapped in a shower curtain and placed in various bags. As Valentina's head and lungs are being cooked on the stovetop, Tamara begins making dozens of trips from the apartment down the stairs, out the front door, all the way down to the lake that was near their property, where she would dispose of the body parts before coming back and getting more. Valentina's hips and legs were apparently too heavy to haul all the way down to the lake, so she took them to a nearby forest. Tamara's final trip sees her carrying a big silver pot, inside of which is Valentina's head, or at least whatever is left of it after Tamara was done eating most of it. 4 days later, on July 27th, a young couple that was living in the same apartment complex as Tamara and Valentina were out for a walk with their dog out near that lake. And as they're walking, their dog takes off running and stops in front of this huge bag that it's sniffing and pawing and trying to open. And the owners of the dog try to call it back, but they can't get it to get away from this bag. And so the owners walk over and they kind of poke the bag. They can see it's pretty heavy, and they open it up and they find a human torso, and it's Valentina's. When the police show up, the first thing they do is they go to Valentina's apartment, and they're surprised to find Tamara living there. And they're kind of sensitive with her, and they say, "Your friend, your relative, was just found deceased and we need to look around the apartment." Tamara was completely indifferent. She did not care. They had just discovered her body and she didn't care that they were searching the apartment. It was like she knew someday this was going to happen. During the search, the police officers quickly find blood all over the bathroom and in the kitchen. They even find the hacksaw she used that's got blood on it. And they find Tamara's diary that's sitting next to this book about black magic. And the police are horrified when they see that the diary contains meticulous notes that Tamara had kept of all of the ritualistic killings she had perpetrated over the past 20 years. And there was 14 of them. And almost all of them were motivated by Tamara's desire to cast spells that she apparently was reading about in these black magic books she had. And virtually all of these spells required human flesh or other human components. And so she would kill these people, she would use their bodies to cast these spells, and then afterwards she would consume them. Not because that had anything to do with the spell, but because she liked the way people tasted, in particular human lungs. The police arrest Tamara, who doesn't put up a fight. She says, "Yep, you got the right person. I did all this." While Tamara was on trial, she seemed like she was in a great mood. She told the judge, "I hope you give me a really severe punishment. I expect to die in prison." She was seen blowing kisses to reporters. It was like she was just totally out of touch. Or maybe she literally knew this was going to happen and just didn't care anymore. Tamara, who would be nicknamed the Granny Ripper by newspapers over the course of this trial, was given a life sentence, and to this day, she is still sitting in jail. Here is the surveillance footage of Tamara disposing of Valentina's body, as well as some shots of Tamara during her trial. After spending 21 years in the US Army, a man retires and moves to Central Florida with his wife and young son. Although his family had plenty of money because he had a pension coming in and his wife still worked full-time, he just got bored really quickly after moving to Central Florida and decided he would just take a job doing something just to stay occupied. And so he ended up taking a job at a highway gas station. One of the primary reasons he chose this particular job is because the owners of the gas station didn't care if his son came along to help him stock shelves and hang out behind the cash register. And so for years, that's just how it went. The man would work at the gas station and his son would tag along. Even after his son became a teenager and you'd think might be wanting to do other things, well, the town was so small, there was almost nothing to do. So his son still came along well into his teenage years. One night in 1990, his son, who was 15 years old at the time, was at the station and he was actually taking a break sitting outside on a picnic table. He was reading a magazine, drinking a Mountain Dew, and it's dark out, and he notices out of the corner of his eye that there is a woman walking off of the highway towards the gas station. It was a very quiet night at the time, so there's no cars getting gas, there's nobody there, and there's not really anybody even driving on the highway, and so that's why she really stood out to him. And he turns and he notices her and he thinks to himself, no one ever walks to our gas station. We're on a highway. Everybody drives here. So she must have broken down and she must be coming here to try to use our phone to call a tow truck or something like that. So the woman is walking across the lot, coming closer and closer to the gas station, and the boy at this point has turned his attention back to his magazine, but he would say later that he kept looking up and keeping an eye on her because there was something off about her. The woman ultimately walks right behind him and goes in the door into the gas station. Doesn't acknowledge the boy, doesn't say hi to him, just walks straight inside, and she starts walking up and down the aisles of the gas station. Now, from where the boy was sitting, it's all glass, so he could clearly look in and see his father behind the counter, and he could see the head of this woman as she walked in and around all these aisles. And as soon as the woman was in the store, kind of pacing around the aisles, the boy put his magazine down and was just watching. And he noticed that she was not really shopping. She was just looking down for a few seconds, wouldn't pick anything up, so she wasn't buying anything. And she would look up at the counter where his father was, and she would just stare at him, and then she'd look back down at what she was doing, and she would go through all the aisles. And at some point, the woman just kind of abandons this phony, I'm pretending to shop routine, and just walks up to the counter. Now, nobody else is in the store, there's nobody else coming in, and so the boy could actually fairly clearly hear what she was saying to his father. And she told his father that she had broken down and she needed a ride, and could he drive her to Ocala, which was the next big town north of this gas station. And the boy would say that his father acted very strangely because his father is normally incredibly pleasant with all the customers. He's very chatty even. Like, he talks to everybody who comes in the store. But as soon as this woman had gone in, his dad had seemed kind of dismissive and almost rude to this woman, and when she was talking to him, asking for a ride, he just said, "No, I won't give you a ride." The woman is annoyed by how quickly she's been shot down, but instead of just taking no for an answer, she turns and looks at the boy who's sitting out on the bench, who's looking right at her, and she points at the boy, and she says, "What about him? Is he your son? Can he give me a ride?" The boy notices that his father, who's not within her eyesight, is looking at his son going, "No." Like, whatever she wants from you, you're gonna say no to it. And the boy's a little bit confused by this because he's still trying to understand why his dad was so against helping this woman, because she clearly needs our help, or someone's help, but he just took his dad at face value, and when the woman's pointing at him, he knew, the boy, that if she came over and asked him, he would say no. But it wouldn't come to that, because the boy's father would say to the woman, no, my son's not going to give you a ride. You need to leave here immediately. Do not come back. Leave. We're not going to help you. She's furious. She's cussing him out. She storms out and slams the door. She starts cussing at the boy, and she walks off. The whole time she's turning around and flipping them off and screaming profanities at them, but she ultimately walks off, and the dad kind of followed her out and is standing next to his son as she walks off. And the boy asks his dad, like, what was her deal? Why did that happen? Why did you not want to help her? And the dad just said, I don't know. There was something off about her, and I don't know how to place it, but I did not want her around you. I knew I didn't want to give her a ride. I knew she had to go. A year later, the boy is in his room when he hears his dad in the other room yelling for him to come in here and look at the TV. So he runs into the TV room, and on the TV is the same woman from the gas station, better known as Eileen Wuornos. She was a serial killer who used to pick up her male victims at gas stations in Florida. It's unclear whether the boy or the boy's father were her next victims. But by the time she had shown up at that gas station, she had already killed 4 people. And following that interaction with them at the gas station, she had gone on to kill 3 more people, including someone in Ocala, Florida, which was the town she had asked them to give her a ride to. Eileen had been caught, that's why she was on TV, and she was later sentenced to death.
Have you ever wished you could consume the strange, dark, and mysterious in a live storytelling event? Well, that dream is becoming a reality this year because I'm coming back with another live tour. This year's tour is also going to include a whole bunch of new locations, including the West Coast of the United States, all across the United States, and also one international city. We put together an absolutely amazing show with a whole bunch of awesome stories, including stories you will not hear anywhere else. New content you can only get if you come to this show. But if you want to see it, you gotta act fast because tickets are available right now. If you want tickets, go to tour.ballenstudios.com or click the link in the description below. Again, that is tour.ballenstudios.com. Also, I'm going to be giving away an all-expenses-paid-for trip to come meet me at one of my live shows. That will include airfare, hotel, come hang out with me backstage. It's going to be a whole thing. And so if you want to potentially win that, all you have to do is donate to win at fandiem.com/MrBallen. That is fandiem.com/MrBallen. Get your tickets and enter the sweepstakes today. I can't wait to see you at the show.
In the early evening of May 7th, 2008, a 65-year-old woman named Zivana Temolkoska walked around her kitchen inside of her apartment in the little southeastern European city of Kisevo. Kisevo is a quiet place at the base of this huge mountain in northern Macedonia, and while it's totally beautiful, it's utterly remote, and basically nothing really of note happens here. Zivana cleaned houses for a living, but on this particular day, she was on a day off, and so she was just kind of hanging out at her apartment, waiting for her adult son, named Zoran, to come home. It was a beautiful, warm evening that night, and so Zivana had the windows in the kitchen open as she walked around making herself something to eat, and at some point as she was doing this, she heard her phone ring. And so she grabbed it and answered, and she heard the sound of her friend on the other line. But her friend's voice sounded strange. It was strained and very uncomfortable, and she was asking Zivana if she was paying attention to the news right now. Did she have the radio on or the TV? And Zivana was like, no, why? And the friend would tell her that all over the news right now, there was this huge, terrible traffic accident that had happened in their town, and unfortunately, Zivana's son, Zoran, who she was waiting for to come home, was apparently involved in this accident. Zivana let out a strangled cry when she heard this, and then just dropped what she was using to make food and turned and ran out the door. And when she did, her neighbor who was outside saw her emerge and yelled out to her, hey, is everything okay? And Zivana, as she literally just continued running towards the road, she basically blurted out to the neighbor that her son was hurt and she was going to the hospital. And this neighbor watched as Savannah just ran down the road, turned the corner, and disappeared. Savannah did not have a car of her own, and so literally she was going to run to the hospital to make sure her son was okay. A little while later, that same neighbor who had just watched Savannah disappear around the corner heard a knock on their door. And so the neighbor went to the door, they opened it up, and they were totally shocked at who they saw standing outside. It was Savannah's son, Zoran, who did not appear to be hurt in any way. But before the neighbor could ask any questions about this, Zoran, who looked visibly confused, said to the neighbor, hey, have you seen my mom? We were supposed to meet and have dinner together, and it's just totally unlike her to disappear without telling me where she was going. The neighbor just stared at Zoran for a second, having no idea what was going on here, and then the neighbor was like, well, wait a minute, Zoran, were you in a car accident? And Zoran's like, no, what are you talking about? And then the neighbor kind of filled Zoran in about how they had seen his mother run outside, and she had mentioned how her son had been in this car accident, and she literally ran to the hospital. Zoran was just as mystified by this as the neighbor was, and so Zoran just grabbed his phone and called the hospital to see if his mother was there. But when the hospital picked up, they would tell Zoran that his mother was not there, she had not been there all day, and two, even though they had heard reports about this car accident in town, there had not been any car accident victims brought to the hospital at all that day. And so by the end of that night, when Zoran really had no idea what had happened to his mom, where she was, or, what was going on with this car accident thing, he just did the only thing he could think to do, which was go to the police and report his mother missing. 9 days later, on May 16th, when still Savannah was missing and the police had no idea what happened to her, there were no new leads, nothing, on this day, a 56-year-old reporter named Vlado Teneski, who actually happened to live not that far away from where Savannah lived, he got a call from one of his police sources. And the source would tell him that Savannah had actually just been found, even though this was not public information, and unfortunately, Savannah was dead. Her body, which had been beaten and strangled and stabbed, had been found wrapped up in plastic and dumped in this illegal dumping area not far from the town's football stadium. The source told Vlado that when her body was searched, they discovered she still had valuables on her person, and so that kind of ruled out the possibility that this was a robbery gone wrong, which was the initial theory about what they were seeing. However, when police had done an initial probe into Savannah's life to figure out who this victim was, they discovered that she was just this poor old cleaning lady who had no enemies to speak of, and so it really just made no sense that she was the victim of such an obviously brutal and intimate murder that was not financially motivated, at least not on the surface. Vlado thanked his source for all the information and then hung up. Vlado's source had sounded really shocked by this murder as he was telling Vlado, but now, as Vlado was sitting here thinking about what he had just been told, he wasn't really shocked as much as he was suspicious. He felt like something just was off about this murder. Maybe Savannah appeared to be this poor old cleaning lady with no enemies, but in reality, maybe that wasn't who she was. Maybe she was leading a secret life that got her killed. Or maybe she had stumbled upon something she was not supposed to see and that got her killed. Vlado had no idea, but he just felt like, there's something off about this and it needs to be investigated. Now, Vlado had a reputation in town for being this very aggressive and kind of fearless journalist who had no problem diving headfirst into some of these really murky stories that could involve corruption or misuse of power, and he would get to the bottom of it, and he would publish these articles where he spoke really critically about the government, about police, about anybody really who was in a position of power. But as a result of conducting himself this way, over his 30-year career, Vlado had been threatened with violence many, many times for things he had written or things he was about to write. But even though Vlado knew this Savannah murder case had the potential to once again put him in hot water with the powers that be, he still felt like it was his responsibility to dive into this thing and get to the truth. So, feeling determined, Vlado grabbed his notebook and pen, and he walked out the front door of his house, and he made the several-minute-long walk over to Savannah's house. And when he got there, her son, Zoran, opened the door, and a few minutes later, Vlado and Zoran were sitting in the kitchen talking about what had happened. Zoran told Vlado all about how he came home and discovered his mom wasn't there, and then he went to the neighbor's house and they explained how, they had seen Savannah running off to the hospital to go look for Zoran, but Zoran's like, I'm not hurt, I didn't get into a car accident, what's going on here? And as Zoran spoke, Vlado took lots of notes and asked lots of follow-up questions, and by the end of this interview, when Vlado felt like he knew everything there was to know about Savannah, he felt like he actually had a pretty good working theory as to what actually happened to Savannah. And the reason he felt like his theory could be accurate had to do with what Zoran told Vlado his mother did for a living, that she was a cleaning lady. Now, it took Vlado a couple of days to put together his story. He had to go out and interview dozens more people in the neighborhood. But finally, on May 19th, so just 3 days after Savannah was found murdered, Vlado published his story in the newspaper. And the story's explosive headline read, "A Serial Killer Stalks Kosovo." In the story, Vlado says that Savannah's murder was very likely not an isolated killing. Instead, her murder was likely linked to 2 other murders of 2 other women. And these 2 other victims looked an awful lot like Savannah, literally. They were poor, older women who were also cleaning ladies. And so that was why when Vlado was talking to Zoran and Zoran described how his mother was, what she did for work, what she looked like, that Vlado started to remember these other victims and he put it all together. The other 2 victims were 64-year-old Mitra Simjanoska, who was murdered in 2005, and the other victim was 56-year-old Lubitsa Lukoska, who was murdered in 2007. Now, Vlado's story was totally explosive because what he's saying is that there is a serial killer that is on the loose in this town. But this story was also highly explosive because Vlado spoke very critically about the police who were involved in this investigation. Specifically, he pointed out that the 05 and 07 murders of those 2 other women, those had been totally mishandled because arrests had been made in at least one of those cases, and clearly whoever they arrested was innocent here. And so the police just totally dropped the ball, at least in Vlado's opinion. And when the police read Vlado's story, they were very upset at him because he was so critical of them. However, the police also did see that Vlado had managed to uncover a lot of new details from all of his interviews with witnesses and people in the neighborhood that did seem to paint a picture of this potentially really being a serial killer, not individual isolated killings. And so the police, based on Vlado's story, would actually begin investigating a serial killer in their midst. They linked all 3 murders and they began basically a new investigation. However, at the same time they began this new investigation, Vlado began to notice that he was being tailed all the time by police. He would be out in town doing his job, reporting and interviewing people, and there'd just be a police officer standing somewhere in the distance watching him. But Vlado had anticipated that no matter what, he was likely going to face some sort of blowback from the police, and so he just kind of accepted that they were going to watch him and maybe try to intimidate him, but it wasn't going to bother him because he had done his job, he had reported the story the best that he could, and if they wanted to watch him from a distance, they could do that. By early June, so about 2 weeks after Savannah had been found murdered, the police, in this new serial killer investigation they were doing, had narrowed down their suspect pool, which was in the hundreds, down to just 3 people. And they felt like they were very close to making an arrest. About a month later, on June 20th, so by this point Vlado is still being trailed by police all the time, but the police have not come out publicly and said anything about the serial killer case. They're just continuing their investigation. But on this day, June 20th, Vlado's editor at the newspaper got a call from a police officer telling the editor they were about to make an arrest in the serial killer case. And as soon as their conversation ended, the editor called Vlado to tell him the news. But when he called Vlado, Vlado didn't pick up, which was very unusual. Vlado always answered his calls. And the editor was also thinking to himself how strange it was that this officer had contacted him and not Vlado. Like, why aren't you going to the guy writing the stories and telling him about this new development? Why are you coming to me? The editor would continue to try calling Vlado several more times, but Vlado never answered. And so ultimately, the editor just kind of assumed that Vlado must be busy, interviewing someone, or maybe more likely, he had already learned about this imminent arrest, and he was on scene, ready to capture in real time this arrest that was about to take place. Meanwhile, on a quiet street in Kasebo, the police had surrounded this very modest two-story home that was very overgrown out front. It was surrounded by tall fir trees, and all the windows had heavy drapes covering them up. And then once the police felt like they had totally surrounded this building, a team of officers walked up onto the porch and knocked on the door and yelled out that they were police and whoever was inside to come out with their hands up. And for a moment, it was just silent and tense. And then the police on the porch heard footsteps inside the house. They had their guns ready to go. And then the door slowly opened up. And this man, who seemed very unthreatening and kind of confused, stepped out onto the porch. And the police immediately arrested him and took him away. A few minutes later, back at the newspaper headquarters, Vlado's editor got another phone call. And when he answered, it was the same police officer who had called before to warn him about this upcoming arrest. Except this time, the officer was calling to say the arrest had been made, they had caught their serial killer, and then he told the editor the name of the person they arrested. And when the editor heard the name, he dropped the phone in shock. The serial killer was Vlado. It would turn out that Vlado appeared very professional and calm on the outside, but inside, he was full of rage, specifically at his mother, who he viewed as this terrible, cruel person. And after she died in 2002, Vlado became obsessed with this idea of getting revenge on his deceased mother. And the way he decided he would do that would be by killing random women who just kind of looked and seemed an awful lot like his mother, i.e., they were poor, older, and cleaning ladies. His three victims, Mitra in 2005, Lubitsa in 2007, and Zvana in 2008, had all personally known Vlado's mother. And so Vlado had actually used that connection to gain each of his victims' trust, and then once he had their trust, he would lure them away to strangle, stab, and beat them to death. In Vlado's explosive newspaper story, he lied about a whole bunch of things just to throw the police off. Like, for example, he made up that he spoke to a witness who claimed to have seen Zvana get into a car with two men right before she vanished. Vlado did not see that. That was just a total lie designed to confuse the police. Vlado had also been the one to plant that story on the radio about Zvana's son, Zoran, being in this terrible accident. That had caused Zvana to run out of her house and be vulnerable to be scooped up and killed, which is exactly what Vlado wanted. He had called the radio station and told them about this accident, and because he had previously worked for that radio station, they believed him without doing any fact-checking and broadcast the story. And so really that whole radio broadcast was just a very intentional trap by Vlado to kill Zvana. But what ultimately got Vlado caught was in the article he wrote, he left in some really specific details that the police had not revealed to the public. And so basically by including these in the story, it meant Vlado had an inside scoop into what was really going on. Like, for example, Vlado said that all three of these women who had been killed by the serial killer had been strangled to death by telephone cords that were left at the scene. But again, the police had not revealed that to the public, and so when they read the story, they actually became very suspicious of Vlado and thought he could be involved in these murders. And so when Vlado felt like the police were trailing him just to intimidate him, in reality, the police were trailing Vlado because they thought he could be the murderer, and eventually, when they got a DNA sample from Vlado, it was confirmed that their suspicions were right. He was the killer. After Vlado's arrest, he was immediately charged with 2 of the 3 murders, and the police were getting ready to charge him with the 3rd, and they were even looking at a 4th victim, potentially, that maybe Vlado had killed as well, but they weren't entirely sure yet. But on June 23rd, so just 3 days after Vlado's arrest, he died in jail in a way that really didn't make any sense. Vlado had drowned in a small bucket of water inside of his jail cell, while there were 3 other people inside of that jail cell with him who all said they didn't notice it happening. Officially, Vlado's death was ruled a suicide, and after his death, all of the murder investigations were closed.
On a late winter afternoon in 1985, a Canadian border security guard stood at the border between New York State and Ontario, Canada. And as he looked out at the dozens of cars lined up at his checkpoint,
he felt an enormous amount of responsibility. Because for him, working at border security was not just about checking people's passports. It was also about making sure dangerous criminals from the United States did not flee their country and enter Canada. And today, there was one particular dangerous criminal from the United States that this guard was on high alert for. A 30-year-old man named Alex Mangle. A few days earlier, Alex Mangle had been stopped by a police officer near New York City. And during this traffic stop, Alex had somehow taken the police officer's gun and shot the officer in the head, killing them, and then Alex had fled, and he was still on the run. And so now law enforcement was concerned that because New York was only 6 hours from the Canadian border, that it was very possible that Alex might try to flee into Canada to escape persecution. And so US and Canadian law enforcement and border security were on the lookout for Alex Mangle. And he was this 30-year-old white man with thinning brown hair and a wispy mustache. And so all day long, that Canadian border security guard looked very closely at every person who came through his checkpoint to see if they were Alex Mangle. He would see a family on their way to visit relatives in Canada. He would see a couple on their honeymoon. He would see a man with a car full of camping supplies and a middle-aged woman traveling alone, and all these different people from all walks of life, but none of them looked anything like Alex Mangle. And so by the end of his shift, after checking dozens and dozens of cars and looking at every person, he felt certain that Alex Mangle had not slipped through his checkpoint. And so he clocked out and he went home. A few days later, on March 2nd, a police officer was patrolling this parking lot right outside of a shopping mall in Ontario, Canada, which was located about an hour and a half away from the border. And during his patrol, at some point, he noticed there was this one car, a white Toyota, that had been loitering in the area for quite a while. And so he decided to drive over and see what was going on. And when he got there, he looked inside the vehicle and he saw someone sitting on the passenger seat. And he was a white man, probably in his 30s, with thinning brown hair and a wispy mustache. And this officer immediately recognized this guy as being the wanted criminal, Alex Mangle. And so the officer immediately called for backup. And then he parked his car, got out, and approached the white Toyota where this guy was sitting with his gun drawn. And as the officer approached the passenger side door, the man inside turned, noticed the officer, jumped into the driver's seat, fired up the car, and the Toyota sped out of the parking lot. And so the officer, he jumps back in his cruiser and he takes off after him. And before long, it was like the entirety of the police force in Toronto was a part of this high-speed chase to catch this guy. And eventually they funneled the car into a dead-end street, and the white Toyota crashed into a stop sign, and then the man inside with the mustache and the thinning brown hair pops out, and immediately everybody sees, yep, that's Alex Mangle. He didn't put up a fight at that point. He was taken into custody. However, despite how relieved law enforcement was to have this cop killer in custody, they realized they didn't understand something. How was it that Alex Mangle got past border security and got into Canada? Everybody was on high alert looking for him. What happened? And so police were baffled until they searched that white Toyota Alex had been driving. On the night that Alex shot and killed that police officer near New York City, he immediately fled to this wooded area and hid out overnight. And then the next day when he got up, he was walking around and he happened to pass by this commercial building. And as he was looking at it, he saw this middle-aged woman, whose name was Beverly Capone, come out of the building and make her way towards her car. And she was all alone. And so Alex walked up to her and abducted her at gunpoint, and then he drove her to this cabin out in the woods that he knew would be totally isolated, no one was there. And once they got there, he murdered her, and then once she was dead, he stole her clothes and put it on, and also cut off her face and her scalp and put those on as well. He was literally wearing her skin and hair. And he hopped in that white Toyota and he drove up to the Canadian border, and amazingly, he got through the checkpoint into Canada without anybody noticing. It would turn out that Canadian border security guard who all day was checking for Alex Mangle did actually see Alex Mangle. He just didn't recognize him because Alex Mangle was wearing Beverly Capone's face, hair, and clothes. And so he thought he was just a middle-aged woman traveling alone, and he let him on through. And so police would figure this whole thing out when they searched that white Toyota, because they would find lying on the floorboard was Beverly's dress, scalp, and face. Alex was deported back to the US. However, before he could stand trial, he attempted to escape a prison transport and in the process got shot to death by police. However, that was not the end of Alex's story. Following his death, officers continued to investigate him and also his property,
And at some point during a search of his property, they would discover all these photos of unidentified women, along with these maps where these very isolated places in New York and Pennsylvania were circled, and nobody knows what they mean. Now, police have not conclusively linked Alex to any other murders, but he does remain a suspect in several cases, and in fact, many investigators believe Alex was actually a serial killer. However, we'll probably never know how many people Alex actually killed because he took all of his secrets to the grave.
On the morning of February 2nd, 2012, a young man pulled off a 4-lane highway in Anchorage, Alaska, into a large, snowy parking lot. He passed by dozens of parked cars until he arrived in front of this small shack that was brightly teal colored. It was a popular coffee shop called the Common Grounds, and this young man worked as a barista there. After he parked his car, he walked up to the white door employee entrance to this little building, and he got his key out and he went to unlock the door, but when he turned the key, he saw the door was already unlocked. He knew the girl who had worked the previous night and would have been responsible for locking the shop up. She was 18-year-old Samantha Koenig, and although she had only been on the job for about a month, she seemed very responsible and had never had any issues closing up before. The young man shrugged it off though. He figured people make mistakes, and he went inside. Right away, he noticed that a couple of things just seemed out of place. It was like Samantha must have just left in the middle of her shift without even attempting to clean up. There were napkins on the ground, there were towels out, there were cups still out. And so as this young man is walking over to the cash register to unlock it, he's running through scenarios in his head about how Samantha could have been so sloppy. And then he reached down with his register key, and just like the door, the cash register was already unlocked. When he pulled the tray out, all the money was gone. And that's when he knew they had been robbed. And so he called his boss. The night before, Samantha had asked her boyfriend, Dwayne, to pick her up after her shift at the Common Grounds. Dwayne arrived in front of the kiosk at about 8:30 p.m., which was 30 minutes after her shift should have been over. Dwayne had gotten held up at his job, which is why he was late. And so when he gets there, Dwayne looks around the parking lot and he doesn't see Samantha anywhere. He sees the coffee shop itself is totally dark and looks like it's been closed up for the night. And so Dwayne gets out of his truck into the freezing cold night air, and he walked up to the window of this coffee shop and he pressed his face up to the glass to look inside, but there was nobody in there. Dwayne automatically went back to the fight he had gotten into with Samantha earlier in the night via text message. She had accused him of cheating on her. He had been kind of nonchalant, like he didn't care about it, and what ensued was a really ugly fight. And so as Dwayne is walking back to his truck, he's thinking to himself, maybe Samantha just didn't want to see him because of the fight, and so at the end of her shift, she got a ride home from her father or maybe from a friend, and that's why she's not here. And so Dwayne gets back inside of his truck and he sends a text message to Samantha asking if she's okay, if she's gotten home. But after several minutes of no response from her, Dwayne, even though they were fighting, he still cares an awful lot about his girlfriend. He decides, I gotta go by her house and make sure she's there and that she's okay. And so a couple minutes later, he gets to her house, he goes up to the door, and her single father, James, answers the door. Dwayne explains that he didn't see Samantha after her shift and just wanted to make sure she was here, but James says, she's not here. I have no idea where she is. I haven't spoken to her. And so the two men go into James's kitchen, they sit down, and they start texting and calling Samantha to try to figure out where she is. And after a couple of minutes, Dwayne's phone lights up, and it's a text message from Samantha. And the message clearly indicates that she's still very upset with Dwayne, but she's saying that she needs some time to think, and that she's gonna be with some friends for a couple of days, and would he, Dwayne, let her father know where she was. And so Dwayne shows James the text message, and Samantha's father looks at it, and he's thinking to himself, this is very uncharacteristic of Samantha. He had raised Samantha since she was 2 years old, and they were very close. They shared everything with each other. It didn't make any sense that she wouldn't contact him directly to say that she was going to be out with friends for a couple of days. And it didn't make sense that she would ignore all of his phone calls and text messages when clearly he was worried about her. The two men stayed up super late, calling and texting, hoping to get more information from Samantha, but she never responded, she never texted back. And so the following morning, when neither men had gotten any more messages from Samantha, Samantha, James went to the Anchorage Police Department and filed a missing person report for his only daughter. After receiving this missing person report, an officer with the Anchorage Police Department called the owner of the Common Grounds coffee shop to ask about Samantha. And the owner actually said they just got a call from their barista that was working at the kiosk that morning, and they had informed them that apparently there had been a robbery and no one can get in touch with Samantha. No one knows where she is. The owner told the police officer that as soon as she got her hands on the security footage from the night before, she would send it over to the police department. While the police waited for this footage, some officers began calling Samantha's friends and other family members to see if they knew where she was, but no one had heard from her and no one knew where she was. No one had any information. Some other police officers headed over to the Common Grounds coffee kiosk to get a look at it for themselves. And when they got there was no sign of a struggle outside or inside the kiosk, and inside, underneath the counter, was a panic button that had not been pressed. And so even though Samantha's father thought there was something odd about her final text message, the police began operating under the theory that Samantha had robbed the kiosk and then left of her own accord. But what confounded police was how Samantha actually physically got away from the coffee shop. She didn't have a car that night, and she couldn't have just walked away because the weather was way too miserable and cold outside, and Anchorage is just not really a walkable city. And so if Samantha was telling the truth, that she was just taking a couple of days to be by herself with some friends at their place, then why didn't any of her friends know where she was? This question was answered later that day when the owner of the coffee shop made the security footage available. The footage, which has no audio, picks up around 8 p.m. on February 1st, 2012, which was the night Samantha went missing. It shows Samantha inside of the kiosk. She's working alone, she's cheerful, and she's busy. And then at some point, someone that we can't see, they're outside of the camera's range, comes up to the window and orders a drink. Samantha clearly turns to them, acknowledges their drink order, and turns and begins making this drink. And then after she's done making it, she turns to give it to this person, and immediately Samantha steps back and puts her arms up. And then seconds later, she reaches over and turns off the lights inside of the kiosk, and then she gets down on her knees with her back to the window. She stays in that position, not talking, not moving, for about a minute before she slowly stands up and walks down the kiosk towards the cash register. She opens it up, she scoops some money out of it, then she walks back to the window and appears to hand it to a shadowy figure on the other side of the window, and then Samantha turns, kneels again with her back to the window. 2 more minutes go by before this person outside the window leans their entire upper body inside of the coffee shop. They reach down and they appear to tie Samantha's hands. Now, because it was dark inside of the kiosk, the footage winds up being extremely grainy, and there's no way to identify who this figure is. Although it's fairly obvious that it's a male. He's wearing a big sweatshirt and he's got a hat pulled down low over his face. After this mystery man is done tying Samantha's hands, he leaps through the window and then shuts the window behind him. And then he stands Samantha up, he puts a gun into her back, and then he marches her out the employee door and then out across the lot, all the way to a white pickup truck where he puts her inside and they drive off. Over the next couple of days, the police and also the FBI, who had been called in to be a part of this investigation, they just kept hitting dead end after dead end because there was no evidence. All they had was this surveillance footage that was too grainy to tell who this guy was that took Samantha. Meanwhile, Samantha's father, James, had rallied the support of nearly all 300,000 people that lived in Anchorage to go out and look for his daughter. His efforts were so profound, it had attracted major news outlets across the country, and suddenly his daughter's story had grabbed national headlines everywhere. This led to strangers donating thousands of dollars to fund a reward for anybody that had information about Samantha's whereabouts. But despite this reward growing in size every single day, and the national news media becoming increasingly more interested in this case, no one came forward with useful information that led to developments in this case, and Samantha never got in touch with Dwayne or her father. Then on February 24th, so 3 weeks after Samantha's gone missing and no one's heard from her, Dwayne got a text message from Samantha's phone, and it was directing him to a particular sign inside of a nearby public park. And so Dwayne and James read this text, they shared it with the police department, and then they raced to this park and actually beat the police there by about 15 minutes. And so Dwayne and James, they walk through the gates and they start walking down this main trail, and they stop in front of this sign. It was actually a bulletin board, and tacked on the bulletin board was a Ziploc bag inside of which was a typed ransom note, and on the ransom note, literally Xeroxed onto it, was a black and white photo of Samantha. And in this photo, Samantha looks kind of dazed, like she's got a blank expression, and she's not really looking at the camera, she's looking just to the side of the camera. And then in this picture, a man is holding a copy of the Anchorage Daily News newspaper that's dated February 13th, 2012. This was a proof of life photo where Samantha's captor was holding up that newspaper to indicate that Samantha was alive as of February 13th. And so to everybody involved in this case, including Samantha's father, even though this is still not a good situation at all, it was kind of a relief to know that at least as of last week, Samantha was alive. As for the demands of this ransom note, James was told to deposit $30,000 into his daughter's account immediately, and if he did that, she would be released 6 months later. As advised by the FBI, James deposited a portion of the ransom money into his daughter's account, and then the FBI just waited and watched, because they knew if anyone tried to withdraw money from that account, they could track where the card was. A few days later, 3 separate withdrawals were made within Anchorage, but each time the FBI got a notification about one of these withdrawals, they would rush to the scene, and whoever it was that had tried to make this withdrawal was long gone. When they pulled the security footage from these 3 different ATMs, the person that was making these withdrawals was a man wearing a ski mask and big sunglasses, so they had no way to identify him. After these withdrawals, the account went silent for over a week, and in that time, there was no word from Samantha. Then on March 7th, more withdrawals were made, but they were in Arizona, and then New Mexico, and then in Texas. Again, authorities would rush to these ATMs, but they would get there right after the masked man with sunglasses had just left. But there was a break this time. In one of these surveillance videos from one of the Texas ATMs, they spotted the car this guy was getting into before he left. And it was a small sedan, it was a white Ford Focus, and they saw him leave going east on a Texas highway. And so authorities in Texas were told to look out for this particular car in this part of Texas. And sure enough, on March 13th, a Texas patrolman spotted the car sitting in a hotel parking lot. He waited nearby until a man in his 30s walked out of one of the hotel rooms, walked down and got inside the car, and then this patrolman just kind of followed him and looked for any reason to pull him over. And as he had his radar gun on this guy, he noticed he was going 2 miles per hour above the speed limit, and so he pulled him over. The patrolman got out, he walked up to the driver's side window, the window was already down, the man was very calm. The patrolman asked him for his license, and the guy handed him an Alaskan license. His name was Israel Keys, he was 34 years old, and he lived in Anchorage. The patrolman knew this was the guy. He called in backup, and before long they were searching Keys' car, and in the trunk they found a ski mask along with other clothes that matched the description of the guy who was making the withdrawals from these different ATMs. They also found a gun, as well as Samantha's cell phone and debit card. After Keys was arrested and was brought into custody, he denied having any involvement with Samantha's disappearance. But after being presented with the overwhelming evidence that suggested otherwise, he caved and said yes, he would tell them the full story of what happened to Samantha, but they had to get him an Americano coffee, a peanut butter Snickers, and a cigar. Once he had said items, he began to speak. And what he said was so disturbing and so graphic, the FBI still has not released the full transcript of his confession. Here is the version of events based on what was made public. On February 1st, 2012, Keys decided he was going to rob the Common Grounds coffee kiosk. He walked up to the window expecting there to be some teenager working inside, and he was right. It was Samantha. He asked her for an Americano, and while she turned to make his drink, suddenly his plan changed. Not only was he going to steal money from inside of this coffee shop, he decided he was going to steal Samantha from this coffee shop. When she turned back with his drink and handed it to him, he discreetly pulled his gun out and aimed it at her and told her this was a robbery. That's when she backed up and put her hands up, and then she turned around, he tied her hands, he jumped back inside, and then he said after he shut the window, he jammed napkins inside of her mouth so she couldn't make any sound, and then he marched her out the door, outside, into his car, and they took off. Once they were in the vehicle, he pulled the napkins out of her mouth, and he told her if she tried to escape or if she tried to flag anybody down, that he would just kill her. And so he said she was very obedient. She was obviously very scared, but she was trying to do her best to stay composed. At some point, Keys reached over and took her phone and sent that text message to her boyfriend informing him that she was going to be spending a couple of days with friends and that he should tell her father. And then Keys told Samantha he was going to be holding her hostage and trying to extract some ransom money. Samantha told Keys that her family was very poor and that he wouldn't get much money out of them. To which Keys said, "Don't worry about it. I know they'll raise money and they'll come up with it somehow." Then they drove around Anchorage for several hours, periodically stopping so Samantha could get out and relieve herself, other times so Keys could smoke a cigar. Then around midnight, Keys made his way back to his house, and he pulled into the driveway, and he turned to Samantha, and he had her go in the back seat and lie down, and he put some tarps over her, and he told her if she tried to escape, he would kill her. And then Keys got out and he walked inside of his house where his 10-year-old daughter and his girlfriend were fast asleep. And in just a few hours, Keys and his daughter were scheduled to go to New Orleans for a 2-week-long luxury cruise. Keys left his house and went back to his car. He put a blindfold on Samantha and then led her down the driveway to his shed. Once inside, he sat her down on an upturned bucket in the back of the shed, and then he put a rope around her neck and he anchored each end of the rope to the wall so she was pinned to the wall. Then Keys turned his radio all the way up to make sure it masked any noise she might make, even though he reminded her repeatedly that if she made any noise, he would just kill her, and by and large, she was very obedient. And then he gave her a couple of cigarettes to smoke and told her it was going to be just fine, to just chill out, that he was going to get the ransom money from their family, and then as soon as that was done, he would let her go. He turned on some space heaters to keep the space warm, and then he left and locked the door. He walked back into his house and double-checked that his daughter and his girlfriend were still asleep. They were. Afterwards, he started drinking some wine and relaxing, and then after a little while, he got a cup of water and he went back out to the shed. He went inside and he gave the water to Samantha, and he said Samantha was very composed. She was obviously frightened, but she asked him, "Did you speak to my father? Did you figure out the ransom situation?" And Keys told her that, "Yes, I talked to your father. Everything's working out fine. He's going to raise the money. We're going to get you out of here. Everything's going exactly to plan." After that, he walked up to Samantha and he unscrewed the 2 anchors that were holding that rope up against her throat, and then he cut the zip ties on her wrist, allowing her to relax and sit forward and just kind of be at ease for a second. And it was very obvious that Samantha was relieved. Her nightmare was about to be over. But then seconds later, Keys grabbed her really aggressively and tied her up all over again, this time much more thoroughly and much more tightly. It had been a cruel trick. When he cut her handcuffs and undid her necktie, he just wanted to see what she would do if she thought she was being let go. When in reality, he was never going to let her go. There was no ransom. He had not spoken to her father. It was all a big lie. Keys told investigators that as he was tying her up for that second time, he looked at her face, and she had this look of total resignation. He said she knew what was about to happen to her. After Keys tied her up, he left the shed and locked it behind him. He went inside to check one more time to make sure his 10-year-old daughter and his girlfriend were still asleep. When they were, he went back to the shed, he opened it up, he went inside, and this time when he stepped inside, it smelled like urine and sweat, and he looked down at Samantha and she was terrified. He walked up to her and he began to assault her. And then after he was done, he was standing over her, getting his clothes back on, and Samantha very stoically looks up at him and says, "Are you going to kill me?" And he says, "Yes, I am." As he put on his leather gloves, she tried to talk him out of it, but he said there was no other way. Keys would tell investigators that he was very impressed with Samantha's bravery. Shortly before 4 a.m., Keys drove a knife into Samantha's back before choking her until she stopped moving. He told investigators that she never made a sound. After she was dead, Keys left the shed and locked it behind him. He went into his house, he took a shower. Afterwards, he woke up his daughter and told her to start getting ready because they were leaving soon for the airport. While his daughter was getting ready, Keys went back out to the shed. He went inside, he rolled Samantha's body up in a tarp and pushed her towards the back. He unplugged the space heaters, turned off the lights, turned off the music, and then double locked the shed and went back inside the house to make his daughter breakfast. At 5 a.m., a cab showed up at the house, and Keys and his daughter hopped inside, and they made their way to the airport, and then on to New Orleans, where they went on their 2-week-long vacation. After they got back, Keys went inside of his shed, he unrolled Samantha from her tarp, and by his account, she still looked fairly lively, and so he dressed her in some new clothes, he put lots of makeup on her face, he braided her hair, and then he stitched her eyelids open, so it gave the impression she was alive and alert, and then he held up a copy of the Anchorage Daily News next to her, and then took several photos, creating that proof of life photo for the ransom note. If you want to see this photo, you can Google it, but that's up to you. After he took these pictures, he chopped her body up into pieces and then disposed of her in a nearby frozen lake. It would turn out Samantha was not Israel Keys' first victim. He was in fact a serial killer who specifically preyed on completely random people because he enjoyed watching them die. Over the years, he had hid what he called kill kits all over the United States, which were these caches filled with weapons and other tools designed to capture and kill people. This way, no matter where he was in the country, when he had an urge to go kill someone, he would just go to his nearest kill kit, dig it up, and then go target a random stranger. And he didn't care if you were young, old, big, small, male, female, alone, or in a group. Everyone was a target of opportunity. Keyes told investigators that as soon as he saw Samantha inside of that coffee kiosk, instantly he knew he was going to kill her. Everything about the ransom, the robbery, all of it was just a lie to keep her in line, to give her some hope that she might get out of this alive, when in reality, the second she walked outside of the doors of that kiosk, she was dead. Keyes admitted to killing Samantha as well as an older couple up in Vermont, but he would take his own life in a jail cell in December of 2012 before he named any of his other victims. And so to this day, we have no idea how many people he killed. The best guess is 11 based on a drawing he made in his jail cell, but that's just a guess.